Michael never expected his peaceful night to be interrupted by a loud banging at his front door at exactly 4 in the morning. Yet there it was, an echo that shook him awake and made him sit up in bed with confusion running through his tired mind. Because who would be visiting at such an hour? And why would they be making such a racket in the quiet of the neighborhood, where every house normally rested under calm silence at that time? With his eyes barely open, Michael looked toward the glowing red numbers on the digital clock on his nightstand, confirming it was just past 4, and at first he thought maybe it was an emergency, something serious enough to justify waking him and perhaps the entire street. But as the knocking grew louder and more impatient, almost like someone demanding entry rather than politely asking for attention, he pulled himself out of bed, slipped on his robe, and walked carefully toward the front window to peek outside. And that was when he saw her, his neighbor Karen, standing firmly on his porch with a clipboard in one hand and a determined look on her face, her posture stiff as though she were about to deliver orders rather than a request. And Michael's heart sank immediately because dealing with Karen at any hour was never pleasant. But at 4 in the morning it felt like a nightmare he could not escape. Karen had long been known in the neighborhood for her obsession with appearances, her endless involvement in every small matter of the homeowners association, and her constant reminders to people about rules and standards. Whether it was the height of the hedges, the paint on the fences, or the way trash bins were rolled back after collection day. And while most people tried to avoid conflict with her, Michael had on more than one occasion found himself at odds with her bossy ways, especially since she often saw his backyard pool as some kind of display piece for the neighborhood, rather than his personal property, something she could parade in front of others whenever she wanted. But he had always made it clear to her that the pool was his to enjoy and not the neighborhood's attraction. Still, nothing prepared him for what she wanted now, so early in the morning, when even the birds had not started their chorus, and the only sound was her sharp knocking that had now switched to her voice calling his name. "Michael, open up! Michael, this is urgent!" And though every instinct in him told him to ignore her and go back to bed, his curiosity and slight concern made him finally open the door a crack, his eyes half closed from sleep, his voice heavy as he asked her what could possibly be so important at this ridiculous hour. And immediately she leaned forward with her clipboard, her words flowing fast and full of authority, as she explained that the HOA officials were coming for an inspection later that morning, that it was crucial for every detail of the neighborhood to look perfect, and that most importantly she needed his pool to be open right away, because it was, in her own words, the crown jewel of the community, and leaving it covered would send the wrong message about how the residents valued presentation. Michael, standing barefoot and still trying to process the absurdity of the situation, shook his head slowly, reminding her that his pool was not public property, that he had never agreed to let it be used as some showcase for outsiders, and above all that it was still nighttime and he had no intention of uncovering or cleaning anything before dawn. But Karen, true to her reputation, refused to take no for an answer, her face tightening with frustration as she reminded him how much responsibility she carried as the association's coordinator, how her reputation and influence depended on everything being flawless, and how she could not afford to let the HOA officials see a covered pool when they arrived. To which Michael calmly but firmly replied that her responsibilities did not extend into his yard, and that he was not about to open his pool for her vanity project, especially not at 4 in the morning. The exchange grew more heated with each word, Karen's tone climbing louder until it stirred the neighborhood dogs, their barks joining the scene, while a few lights flickered on in nearby windows as sleepy neighbors peeked out to see what was happening. And Michael could feel his patience thinning as he repeated himself, urging her to return home, get some rest, and leave him alone. But instead she pressed her lips tightly, glaring at him as though he had betrayed some great duty, and after a tense pause she declared, "You'll regret this, Michael. I won't let this slide," before spinning on her heels and marching away into the shadows of the street, leaving him standing there in disbelief, wondering if he had just witnessed a minor argument or the beginning of something far more dramatic. Closing the door, he rubbed his face and sighed heavily, telling himself that maybe by morning she would come to her senses and realize how unreasonable she had been. Yet a small unease lingered in his chest because he knew Karen well enough to understand that when she set her mind on something, she rarely backed down, and sometimes her actions crossed the line of normal neighborly disputes into unnecessary drama that drew everyone into her orbit. And so, as he crawled back into bed trying to close his eyes and steal whatever rest he could before dawn, he could not shake the feeling that Karen's parting words were not just frustration in the moment, but a warning of trouble to come. Trouble that might not only test his patience but also bring unwanted attention from others, and though he had no idea what she might do next, he sensed that the night's disturbance was only the beginning of a much larger conflict that would soon unfold. Tension from the earlier police incident still lingered in the air like a cloud that refused to drift away, and Michael, though he tried to stay calm and focus on his own morning routine, could not ignore the way neighbors occasionally glanced toward his house, some offering sympathetic smiles, others whispering quietly as if caught between siding with him or fearing Karen's wrath, because everyone knew Karen had a strong presence in the neighborhood and often used her position as coordinator to pressure people into following her vision of perfection. But Michael, sitting in his living room with a second cup of coffee, decided he would not be intimidated into doing something unreasonable, and he reminded himself that his pool was his property, and no matter how much Karen shouted, threatened, or dramatized, she had no right to demand control over it. Outside, Karen was already pacing the sidewalk, her clipboard in hand, her voice sharp as she directed volunteers to move potted plants, scolded a man for leaving his garden hose coiled improperly, and reminded a family that their front door should be wiped clean of dust. Yet every time she passed Michael's house, she would pause briefly and glare toward the closed backyard fence as though trying to will him into submission. And when Michael finally stepped outside to fetch his mail, she seized the opportunity to confront him once more. Her tone clipped as she said, "The officials will be here any minute, Michael. Are you really going to make us all look foolish?" But he calmly replied, "Karen, I already told you. I will not uncover my pool, and no one will think less of this neighborhood because of that. The inspectors care about rules, not whether my backyard is on display." And though his words were steady, he could see the frustration building in her expression, her knuckles tightening around her clipboard as she warned him that his lack of cooperation would not be forgotten. Yet before the argument could go further, a line of cars slowly pulled into the street, marking the arrival of the HOA officials, who stepped out in tidy suits with clipboards of their own, ready to walk through the neighborhood and evaluate its upkeep. And instantly, Karen's entire posture shifted from anger to performance, her voice suddenly sweet and polished as she hurried over to greet them, shaking hands, smiling widely and gesturing proudly to the home she had worked so hard to prepare. While neighbors lined up nervously to watch the inspection begin, Michael stood at a distance, leaning casually against his porch railing, watching the scene unfold with mixed amusement and unease, because he knew Karen would somehow try to drag his pool into the conversation again. And sure enough, after showing off a few manicured lawns and freshly painted fences, she stopped abruptly in front of Michael's house, her voice raised just enough for the officials and neighbors to hear, saying, "Of course, the jewel of our community is right here. Michael's beautiful pool, which unfortunately isn't open today, but normally it's the highlight of our gatherings." Her eyes darting at him as though daring him to contradict her, and Michael, tired of her passive-aggressive approach, stepped forward with a calm but firm tone, telling the officials directly that while he appreciated their visit, his pool was not a community feature but his private property, maintained for his own use, and that he hoped they would focus on what truly mattered, the compliance of public spaces and shared areas, rather than being misled by unnecessary distractions. And his words, though polite, made Karen's smile falter as the officials nodded thoughtfully, one even agreeing that inspections were meant to focus on rules, safety and upkeep, not personal amenities, which seemed to ease the tension among neighbors, who exchanged relieved looks as if finally realizing Michael was right all along. But Karen, unwilling to let go, tried once again to spin the situation. She saw it as her chance to finally put Michael in the spotlight, and she arrived early, arranging chairs, organizing sign-in sheets, and whispering to a few supporters about how she planned to address the issue of cooperation. While Michael arrived quietly, taking a seat in the back row, prepared for whatever might come but determined not to be baited into anger, the meeting began with the board reading through the inspection report, which was overall positive, highlighting the neat lawns, painted fences, and clean sidewalks. And though the officials noted a few minor issues, they praised the community for its efforts, which should have been enough to leave everyone satisfied. But as expected, Karen raised her hand and launched into a long speech about how much she had sacrificed, how hard she had worked, and how one resident's refusal had nearly destroyed their image, carefully avoiding his name but staring directly at him with each pointed phrase. And for a moment the room was silent, everyone waiting to see if Michael would respond. But instead of speaking, he simply sat calmly, hands folded, until the chair of the HOA board interrupted Karen politely, saying that while leadership and enthusiasm were valuable, it was also important to respect boundaries and avoid exaggerations, reminding her that private property was never part of the inspection requirements, and that unity in a community came not from forcing people to obey one person's vision, but from respecting differences. And the room shifted with a soft murmur as neighbors nodded, relieved that the board had spoken clearly at last. Karen's face tightened, her smile stiff, but before she could regain her ground, another neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, stood up and said gently but firmly that she admired Michael for standing his ground, because everyone had felt pressured by Karen's demands at one time or another, and perhaps it was time to ease up and let people live peacefully. And soon another voice joined in, Mr. Williams, who admitted that while he respected Karen's energy, he also believed that calling 911 over a pool was unnecessary and embarrassing for the neighborhood. And as more neighbors spoke, Karen's grip on the room began to slip, her once loyal audience now revealing the frustrations they had kept quiet. And Michael sat quietly through it all, his heart steady, realizing he did not need to argue, for the truth was speaking for itself. By the time the meeting ended, it was clear that Karen's influence had weakened. Her dramatic control challenged openly for the first time, and though she left the hall with her head held high, clipboard tucked tightly under her arm, her hurried steps betrayed the storm brewing within her. While Michael walked home slowly, greeted warmly by several neighbors who clapped him on the shoulder or smiled reassuringly, and for the first time in days he felt a weight lift from his chest, knowing that he was not alone in this battle. That reason and fairness had begun to shine through the fog of her theatrics. Later that night, sitting by his pool with the cover still in place, he reflected on the whirlwind of events that had begun with a knock at 4 a.m, and though it had caused him stress and frustration, it had also revealed the strength of standing firm with patience and dignity, and he realized that true respect in a community did not come from shouting the loudest or controlling others, but from quietly living with integrity. And as the stars reflected faintly on the still water, Michael felt a calm pride within himself, knowing that he had not allowed fear or pressure to bend him. And though Karen might still try to stir drama in the future, he was no longer worried, for he had learned that truth, patience, and the quiet support of others could withstand even the loudest storms. And so, with a deep breath of night air, he closed his eyes for a moment, thankful that the conflict had not broken him, but instead had strengthened his place among his neighbors, leaving him ready for whatever tomorrow might bring, certain that he had done the right thing by simply saying no when it mattered most. He knew deep down that was unlikely, for Karen was not the kind of person who accepted refusal lightly, and the sharp tone of her words still echoed in his head like an unfinished storm. After showering and making himself a strong cup of coffee, he stepped into his backyard to check the pool, lifting the cover slightly to see if everything was fine, and the calm water beneath reassured him. Yet it also reminded him that in just a few hours the HOA officials would indeed be visiting, and though he didn't care much about their opinions, he could already imagine Karen's frantic efforts to make the neighborhood sparkle. And sure enough, as he walked toward the front yard, he could hear her voice carrying across the street, instructing a neighbor to sweep their driveway, reminding another to fix a crooked mailbox, and practically scolding a teenager for leaving a bicycle near the sidewalk. Her clipboard clutched tightly as she wrote notes and gave commands as though she were the mayor of the town, rather than just a resident. Michael shook his head and tried to ignore the spectacle, but his calm morning ended abruptly when 2 police cars slowly pulled into the street, their lights flashing silently, and several neighbors came out of their homes in surprise, whispering to one another about what could be happening so early, and Michael's stomach dropped the moment he saw Karen waving the officers toward his house. Her voice shrill with urgency as she told them that there was an emergency concerning the pool. Confused but not entirely shocked, Michael stepped forward to greet the officers, one of whom politely introduced himself and explained that they had received a 911 call from a resident, claiming there was a disturbance and possible danger related to his property, which made Michael's jaw tighten as he realized exactly what Karen had done. She had actually dialed emergency services at 4 a.m, simply because he would not open his pool for her presentation, and now the entire neighborhood was watching as uniformed officers stood in his driveway, listening carefully as Karen painted a dramatic picture of a community falling apart if his pool was not uncovered and ready for inspection. Insisting that his refusal was a threat to the HOA's reputation, and that immediate action was needed. Michael listened in disbelief as Karen spoke with the kind of conviction one might use when reporting a serious crime. And though the officers tried to remain neutral, their sideways glances at one another betrayed their confusion, because clearly this was not an emergency at all. And when they finally turned to Michael to hear his side, he calmly explained that Karen had woken him at 4 a.m., demanding he uncover his private pool for the sake of her presentation, that he had politely refused because it was not her place to dictate how he managed his backyard, and that she had apparently escalated the matter by calling 911 with exaggerated claims. And the officer nodded slowly, clearly understanding the situation, before turning back to Karen and reminding her that emergency lines were not to be used for personal disputes, that doing so wasted valuable resources that might be needed elsewhere, and that unless there was a genuine safety concern, police presence was unnecessary. But Karen, unrelenting, tried to argue, her voice rising as she claimed the officials would be arriving soon, that the pool was essential for their impression, and that Michael was selfish for refusing to cooperate, to which the officer raised his hand gently but firmly, telling her that while neighborhood disputes could be taken up with the HOA board, they were not a matter for law enforcement, and she would need to resolve it through proper channels instead of emergency services. Neighbors standing nearby murmured to one another, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others quietly chuckling at the absurdity, and Michael felt both embarrassed and relieved as the officers eventually wished him a good day and left, leaving Karen red-faced and fuming in the middle of the street, her clipboard clutched so tightly that the papers crumpled at the edges. Michael turned to walk back into his house, hoping the incident was finally over. But Karen's glare followed him like a shadow, and he knew she would not let the matter rest so easily, for her pride had been wounded in front of everyone. And if there was one thing Karen despised, it was losing control of the narrative. Sure enough, within an hour, he saw her marching up and down the block again, rallying a few sympathetic neighbors and convincing them that his refusal was an act of sabotage against the entire community, that he was intentionally trying to embarrass them before the officials. And though many neighbors rolled their eyes and quietly sided with Michael, a few were swayed by her fiery words, agreeing that the pool would have looked nice if it were open, and Michael realized that what had begun as a ridiculous midnight argument was now spiraling into neighborhood drama that could tarnish his standing with some of the residents. Sitting on his porch with his coffee cup, he considered his options, wondering if he should reach out to the HOA board directly to explain what had really happened, or if it was better to simply stay quiet and let Karen's anger burn itself out. But deep down he had a sinking feeling that silence would only give her room to twist the story further, and he braced himself for what might happen next when the officials actually arrived and found themselves caught in the middle of a neighborhood tug-of-war, sparked by nothing more than a covered pool and a neighbor who could not accept the word no, reminding the officials how much effort she had put into organizing the morning, and suggesting that cooperation from every resident was essential to maintain high standards, clearly hoping they would criticize Michael for not uncovering his pool. Yet instead, one official gently but firmly told her that while leadership was important, it was equally important not to misuse authority or pressure residents beyond their obligations. And those words struck Karen like a stone, leaving her momentarily speechless, though her eyes still burned with indignation as she scribbled furiously on her clipboard, pretending to take notes. Michael, sensing that the moment had shifted in his favor, returned quietly to his porch, but inside he felt a mixture of relief and caution, for he knew Karen would not accept defeat gracefully, and already he could see her whispering to a couple of neighbors, likely spinning another version of the story, one that painted her as the victim of his stubbornness. And while the officials continued their tour without paying attention to the pool again, Michael realized that the real challenge was not the inspection itself, but the ongoing battle with a neighbor who seemed determined to control everything around her, even if it meant calling the police, rallying allies, or bending the truth. And as the officials eventually left the neighborhood, thanking everyone for their cooperation, the residents slowly dispersed, some returning to their routines, others lingering in small groups to gossip, while Karen, still restless, stood stiffly in the center of the street, her pride visibly wounded yet her determination unbroken, and Michael, watching her from his porch, could not help but wonder what she would attempt next, because if there was one thing he had learned about Karen, it was that her need for control and recognition always pushed her to escalate, and the morning's events, though dramatic, felt less like an ending and more like the opening act of a conflict that was far from over. Steady hum of gossip that moved from porch to porch as neighbors discussed what had unfolded earlier, with the police and the HOA officials, and while many quietly admired the way Michael had stood his ground with calm dignity, others worried that Karen's relentless nature would soon stir up more trouble. For they all knew her pride had been bruised in front of an audience and that she was not one to let matters rest when her authority was questioned, especially by someone who had already resisted her many times before. Michael tried to go about his day as normally as possible, mowing his front lawn and checking emails inside. Yet he could not ignore the way Karen seemed to patrol the street with a forced smile, stopping at houses to thank residents for their cooperation while sliding in pointed remarks about how certain people had refused to support her efforts. And though she never mentioned his name directly, everyone knew exactly who she meant, which left Michael both frustrated and amused, for he realized that her strategy now was not to confront him outright, but to slowly chip away at his reputation among the neighbors, painting herself as the hard-working guardian of the community, and him as the selfish one who undermined her work. By late afternoon, Michael decided it was time to address the matter in a more official way. So he drafted a calm and respectful email to the HOA board, explaining the events of the night before, from Karen waking him at 4 a.m. with demands to her dramatic call to 911 and her attempt to pressure him again during the inspection. And he stressed that he had no desire to cause drama or division, but simply wanted clarity on what was expected of him as a resident, because he believed that his private pool should not be part of any community display, and he wanted to ensure his rights were clear. And after sending the email, he felt a small weight lift off his shoulders, as though he had finally taken control of the narrative rather than letting Karen spin it endlessly. Meanwhile, Karen, apparently realizing that her direct confrontation had not gone as planned, shifted her tactics once more, gathering a small group of sympathetic neighbors in her backyard and speaking passionately about unity, responsibility, and the importance of presenting a strong image to outsiders. And in that meeting, she reportedly complained about how one person's stubbornness could ruin the work of many, her words carefully chosen to sound noble, while clearly targeting Michael. And though a handful of neighbors nodded along, others exchanged uneasy looks, not entirely convinced by her dramatics, for they had seen with their own eyes how exaggerated her behavior had been with the police and the officials, and they quietly felt that she was overreaching. Yet they remained silent out of fear of becoming her next target. As evening settled, Michael stepped outside to take a quiet walk around the block. And though he usually found these walks calming, tonight he noticed how conversations seemed to pause when he passed and how Karen, standing on her porch with arms crossed, watched him with an expression that mixed defiance with triumph, as though she believed she still held the upper hand. And Michael realized that her campaign against him was far from over, and he wondered just how far she would go to make him bend to her will. Later that night, as he sat reading in his living room, his phone buzzed with a reply from the HOA board, and he opened the message quickly, heart pounding a little as he read their carefully written words, which confirmed that private property remained private, and no resident could be forced to use it for community presentation. Yet they also mentioned that they valued unity and cooperation among neighbors, subtly suggesting that compromise was often the best path. And while Michael appreciated the clarification that he was not obligated to uncover his pool for Karen or anyone else, he also understood the delicate balance hinted at in their words that, even though rules protected him, the social dynamics of the neighborhood could still be difficult if Karen continued her pressure. Leaning back in his chair, he exhaled deeply, realizing that the board's reply was both a relief and a warning, and he wondered if Karen had already contacted them with her version of events, perhaps painting herself as the responsible leader and him as the unreasonable obstacle. And if so, he knew she would not let his email go unanswered, for her pride was too strong to allow him the last word. Sure enough, the very next morning, Michael found a folded flyer taped to his mailbox, one that Karen had apparently distributed to multiple homes, filled with flowery language about community pride and shared responsibility, and sprinkled with not-so-subtle reminders that when residents refused to contribute, everyone suffered, and though she never mentioned him by name, it was clear the message was directed at him. And while some neighbors might have shrugged it off, others might see it as a reason to distance themselves from him, which made Michael shake his head in disbelief at how far Karen was willing to go over something as simple as a pool cover. As the days passed, Michael noticed the subtle shift in interactions. Some neighbors greeted him warmly, assuring him with their tone that they supported his stance, while a smaller group offered only curt nods or avoided eye contact, likely swayed by Karen's relentless campaign. And though Michael tried not to let it affect him, he could not deny that living under that constant tension wore on him, especially when he saw Karen smiling confidently, as though each whispered rumor and each wary glance was a victory for her. And yet, beneath his frustration, Michael also felt a quiet determination growing stronger within him, a resolve not to surrender his peace of mind or his principles simply to satisfy someone else's pride. And as he sat one evening by the still-covered pool, watching the fading light reflect softly on the water, he promised himself that no matter what storm Karen tried to stir next, he would meet it with calm strength, for he knew that giving in would not bring peace but only more demands. And though the road ahead promised more drama, he was ready to stand his ground, even if it meant standing alone. Michael, by speaking to anyone who would listen, reminding them of how she had worked tirelessly for the community, and how his refusal had nearly ruined everything. Yet what she did not realize was that the more she pushed her narrative, the more people began to see through it, for neighbors were not blind. They had witnessed her outburst at 4 a.m. They had seen the police cars arrive for no reason, and they had watched her try to embarrass Michael during the inspection. And though some were too polite to confront her, many had quietly grown weary of her behavior, recognizing that her leadership was not about community pride but about personal control. Michael, meanwhile, chose not to fuel the fire with more arguments or public statements, instead going about his daily life with quiet strength, mowing his lawn, walking his dog, greeting those who passed by, and maintaining the pool exactly as he always had, never once uncovering it for display but keeping it clean and well cared for as a symbol of his right to peace. And this calm approach began to earn him respect. For while Karen's words were loud and sharp, his steady actions spoke louder in their own way, showing the neighborhood that he was not the selfish man she described, but a reasonable person protecting his boundaries. Yet Karen's pride could not accept that her campaign was failing. And one evening, when the HOA board scheduled a community meeting in the local hall to discuss inspection results and other matters,